Topic 3. Why had international peace collapsed by 1939? The question refers to the outbreak of war. And you'll remember this mural on the walls of the League of Nations that showed the 5 continents literally interlocking themselves into some kind of collective security. That is, into the principle that an attack on one is considered an attack on all. And it clearly didn't work out like that in 1939. Focus question 1 asks us, what were the long-term consequences of the peace treaties 1919 to 1923? This map shows the Nazi attack on Poland on the 1st of September 1939, which directly started World War II. By attacking Poland, Hitler was disregarding probably the most important section of the Treaty of Versailles. The territorial clause that said that this corridor that connected Poland to the free port of Danzig was to be governed from Warsaw. Now this of course separated eastern part of Germany, East Prussia, from the whole core of Germany, which we can see here. You'll remember this map which shows how Eastern Prussia was separated from the rest of Germany, and that was deeply resented by Hitler. A second resentment was Article 80, which said that Germany acknowledges and will respect strictly the independence of Austria. Well, Austria, of course, was the birthplace of Hitler himself, and so Hitler was never going to have any time for that article. Indeed, it was his mission to reunify Austria as he saw it to Germany itself. And so consequence 1 is this, that the peace treaties fail to give national self-determination to Germans. That's to say that around about 6, maybe 8 million Germans, something like that, were under the rule of Poland, if they lived in Western Prussia, or under the rule of the Czechs, if they lived in Sudetenland. Indeed, Germans lived inside southern Denmark, and there were some German speakers, of course, now in France, now that Alsace-Lorraine had been awarded to France. So according to the Nazis, according to German nationalists, this was a failure of the Treaty of Versailles. You'll recognise Neville Chamberlain at the bottom of this slide. Now, even he, in 1938, referred to Czechoslovakia as an artificial creation. That was not good news for Czechoslovakia. Another consequence of the Treaty of Versailles was this vast reparations bill, because, as we saw in the previous topics, the Germans found this bill very hard to pay. In January 1923, Belgian and French troops invaded. They went to go and get the goods in payment themselves. With the consequence, Germany suffered a terrible hyperinflation, which ultimately, indirectly, led to the popularity of groups like the Communists and the Nazis. And by 1932, of course, Hitler had formed a party that won the election of 1932 and ultimately achieved power. So to sum up, consequence number 2 is that the peace treaties create a financial meltdown in Germany that it's very hard to recover from. Indeed, it was made worse by the Great Depression, which started with the Wall Street crash in America in 1929 and then escalated. Now, of course, this slide that shows how the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan gave large loans to Germany so that Germany could then pay its reparations to France, who in turn then owed money to America. This slide demonstrates a rather lethal financial dependence on America. Dawes and Young were both American financiers who thought they were helping by giving loans to Germany so Germany could pay its reparations bill. But that turned out to be a very, very dangerous situation by 1930-31, when American banks were calling back their loans. They couldn't continue to lend money to Germany. The impact, therefore, of the Wall Street crash on world trade was very destructive. This graph shows the catastrophic effect on the volume of world trade. Naturally, the less that countries trade with one another, then the less they get on with one another. If they're not exchanging goods and services, they are not so dependent upon one another, and that is bad for international cooperation. Germany was the hardest hit. 6 million unemployed. Economic output reduced by a third. And the destruction to the German economy can indeed be traced back to its origin, the reparations bill in the first place, as this cartoon indicates. So now we're in a position to summarise the long-term consequences of the peace treaties. On the left, by 1933, Germany had a government that refused to accept its territorial losses at Versailles. Secondly, reparations had directly brought about hyperinflation in 1923. And thirdly, the solutions to that hyperinflation was for Germany to continue to borrow from America. Now, on the right-hand side, we have some more optimistic things to say about the peace treaties. For example, the peace treaties formed the Free State of Poland. It formed the Free State of Czechoslovakia and others. And these countries did have national self-determination. And secondly, the League of Nations was formed. And that meant an international organisation that was encouraging disarmament in this period. It was encouraging trade talks in this period. So we don't have to be completely pessimistic about the consequences of the peace treaties in 1933. Yes, principally disastrous for Germany, but there were plenty of people in 1933 who were saying that good things, those things on the right-hand side, were positive consequences of the peace treaties. Focus question 2 asks us, how far was Hitler's foreign policy to blame for the outbreak of war in 1939? Let's consider what Hitler's foreign policy aims were. Well, his first aim, of course, we've already covered. He just wanted to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. It was the absolute source of all of Germany's problems, he thought. Foreign policy aim number 2 was connected to this. It was not only are we going to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany to its natural borders, but we are also going to find Lebensraum, or living space, for Germany. And by that he meant, of course, that Germany was going to build an empire to the east, colonize what was the Soviet Union. Well, why Poland and Soviet Union, I should say, Eastern Europe? Why there? Well, foreign policy aim number 3 was to crush the Soviet Union and crush Bolshevism once and for all. Here he is in a rage, saying a victory for Bolshevism over Germany would be the final destruction, indeed the annihilation of the German people. Remember that it had been his fear as a younger man in 1919, 1920, his fear that Germany would fall to the Communist Party that drove Hitler into politics in the first place. Now, foreign policy aim number 4 is, if you like, a tactical aim. It's to say that if Germany is going to rip up the treaties, it's going to destroy the Soviet Union, it's going to crush communism, it will have to divide the Allies from each other. Hitler was aware that if there was a strong alliance between America and Britain and France. We've got on the left-hand side a depiction of these three powers. If he was going to get anywhere at all, he would have to make sure the Americans were detached from Britain and France. And if he could, he would like to divide Britain and France from one another. Here we have an image of the so-called Entente, or cordial agreement between Britain and France, which had been going on now for 20 or 30 years. Well, if Hitler was going to achieve any of his foreign policy aims, it would be very important to divide the British from the French. So how does he set about dividing the Western allies from each other? A good place to start would be May 1933. Here we have the American president saying to the world that he wants to see disarmament, that America proposes that the great powers spend less on weapons and more on their economies. Here we have Hitler's reply the following day. He has a radio broadcast in which he warmly thanks Roosevelt for his speech. What did Hitler have in mind? Well, the Nazis went to the League of Nations disarmament conference and offered to abolish their armed forces if France would do the same. The French would never accept that. They had an advantage, of course. They had a larger army than the Germans in 1933 because of the Treaty of Versailles. And this is the perfect opportunity for Hitler. Hitler turns to the world and says the League of Nations is a sham. It can't bring about disarmament. The French, who are a leading member of the League of Nations, won't disarm. We are offering to disarm. Therefore, we're going to leave the League of Nations. And this slide shows the results of the plebiscite he held for his population, asking, do you agree with our decision to leave the League of Nations? And apparently 95% of Germans say yes. That is a severe blow for the League of Nations and a big propaganda victory for Hitler. Men from the German population, that was breaking the Treaty of Versailles, he was arming them with weapons that were prohibited under the Treaty of Versailles. Most provocatively, he was beginning to build an air force, sort of in secret. It was called a Civil Aviation League rather than the German Air Force at this stage, but it was no secret that the Nazi regime was starting to re-militarize Germany. Prohibited under the Treaty of Versailles. Most provocatively, in 1935, Hitler's foreign policy becomes more assertive. You'll remember that the Saarland was due for a plebiscite 15 years after the signature of the Treaty of Versailles. And when that plebiscite was held, the overwhelmingly German population voted to join with Germany. So far so good for Hitler, his first territorial gain, if you like. In the first few months of 1935, Hitler openly started to rearm. That meant he started to conscript from the German population. That was breaking the Treaty of Versailles. He was arming them with weapons that were prohibited under the Treaty of Versailles. Most provocatively, he was beginning to build an air force, sort of in secret. It was called a Civil Aviation League rather than the German Air Force at this stage, but it was no secret that the Nazi regime was starting to re-militarize Germany. This slide reminds us of the agreement that the Nazis got from Britain. Now, the British government was always very concerned about German submarine building. So in June 1935, knowing full well they couldn't really stop the construction of submarine building, the British government reached this agreement that Germany could expand to 35% of the number of Royal Navy surface ships, and that German submarines could rise to 45% a royal naval submarine strength with a view to actually reaching equality later on. What would have been the French reaction to this treaty? Remember that I was saying that the fourth aim, the tactical aim, if you like, of Hitler's foreign policy was to divide the Allies from one another. And the French, of course, were furious that the British had gone behind their backs, hadn't consulted them, and had negotiated a rather self-serving arrangement that meant that the Germans were now legally able to build a navy that would make them a rather large maritime threat. So the British had revised the Treaty of Versailles without French agreement. Good news for Hitler. And in March 1936, you will remember from this photo, he ordered his army to march into the Rhineland. Well, why did that matter? You remember that the Rhineland had been demilitarized under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The reason for that was that Clemenceau wanted a buffer zone between France and Germany. In March 1936, Hitler was effectively saying that he was going to defend his borders from the very, very western point. Now, of course, Mussolini was the one leader who came out publicly and said, I am not against you doing this. And Hitler had now found a new ally, the Italians. And how did he get away with it? Well, Hitler actually came up with what the British thought was a reasonable excuse. The month before, the French had signed a mutual assistance pact with the Soviet Union of all countries. Well, what could Hitler say? Hitler said, now I am encircled. Germany is encircled as it was in 1914 by France and Russia. And so I must defend my borders. That was the excuse that he gave. And as you can see from this quote, the British sympathised. Lord Lothian famously said, it was no more than the Germans walking in to their own backyard. Now, in July 1936, Hitler had a stroke of luck, which was very little to do with him. The Spanish Civil War broke out. What had happened was there was a rebellion by Franco, who was a fascist general, who disliked the new government, the Popular Front. He thought that the Popular Front had done nothing when some communist rebels had assassinated a Spanish official. And he led a rebel legion from Morocco, actually, across the mainland to try to capture Madrid. So how could Hitler exploit this opportunity that the Civil War offered to him? Well, firstly, he could send forces. He sent the Condor Legion that fought side by side with Franco. Secondly, he sent weapons. For example, Heinkel aircraft could be tested out in a real war situation. And thirdly, he could really perhaps see big value in this. He could really weaken the authority of the League and weaken the authority of the democracies, because he knew that he was demonstrating they could do nothing about his interference in the affairs of a member of the League. After all, it wasn't just Hitler who was offering this material assistance, but Mussolini too. And here we have them together. The Rome-Berlin axis. Both fascist dictators in their military uniforms are now signing a pledge to one another that the world would revolve on an axis that ran from Berlin to Rome. So within this agreement of November 1936, both of the dictators, who by this stage were in limited wars, remember that Mussolini was fighting in Abyssinia at this time and Hitler was fighting indirectly in the Spanish Civil War, they were both pledging assistance to one another in this war situation. So we can now sum up how much had Hitler achieved in his foreign policy aims by November 1936. He'd recovered the Saarland. That was done legitimately. He'd remilitarised the Rhineland and rebuilt his armed forces. Well, they were breaches of the Treaty of Versailles. And thirdly, he was helping to establish a fascist regime in Spain, successfully so. Franco had won the Spanish Civil War by 1939. So focus question 3 asks us, was Chamberlain's policy of appeasement justified? Probably need to define our terms. By appeasement we mean making concessions to an adversary. It means making concessions to an adversary so that they become more peaceful. It assumes that by giving your adversary something, they're going to be satisfied. So Hitler had broken the Treaty of Versailles from 1935, but by 1938 his expansionism, his aggression was plain to see. In February of 1938, he has summoned the Austrian Chancellor, Kurt Schuschnigg, to meet him. Why? Hitler, of course, was an Austrian. He believed that the division of Austria and Germany was artificial. Article 80 of the Treaty of Versailles said, Germany acknowledges and will respect strictly the independence of Austria. Of course, Hitler had absolutely no intention of doing that. So what did Schuschnigg have to agree to in this intimidating one-to-one meeting? Hitler insisted that he appoint this man, Seyss-Inquart, to run the Austrian police. Now, of course, Seyss-Inquart was a Nazi sympathiser, but now, as the Minister of Interior, who ran the security side of Austrian affairs, it meant that Hitler had an indirect control of Austria. Secondly, Schuschnigg had to agree to hold a plebiscite. Well, you can guess what the plebiscite would be about. It would be putting the question to the Austrians, do you agree with union with Germany? Schuschnigg did appoint Seyss-Inquart, but he dragged his heels on the plebiscite. Hitler was furious. On the 13th of March 1938, he ordered the invasion. Now, of course, these photos famously show people welcoming Nazi forces marching into Vienna. Is it good evidence that Austrians supported it? Well, evidently, there was a lot of sympathy with some Austrians for the Nazis. I suppose if you were against it, you'd stay away that day, wouldn't you? Now the Nazis were in control. The Austrian president appointed Seyss-Inquart himself as the new Chancellor of Austria, and Seyss-Inquart then put this question to his population. Do you agree with the reunification of Austria with the German Reich that was enacted on 13th of March 1938? And do you vote for the party of our leader Adolf Hitler? Well, you'll see what sort of democratic process this is. The Ja circle is much, much bigger, isn't it, than the Nein circle, i.e. you're being invited to say yes, and 99.7% did. So who were the Sudeten Germans? There they are, sipping their coffee on the left-hand side in paramilitary uniform. These young German Czechs are under the command of this guy on the right-hand side, Konrad Henlein. He's meeting Hitler here. Doubtless, Hitler is encouraging him to cause disorders. These Sudeten Germans were burning Czech police stations, they were blowing up installations, they were forming riots. Hitler is essentially pursuing a tactic of stirring up discontent from the inside. He was very good at kind of destabilizing the artificial states, as he put it, on his border. This slide shows us where the Sudeten Germans lived on this kind of frontier of Czechoslovakia and Germany. It also reminds us of the Skoda arms factory that was inside this territory. Indeed, the Sudeten German part was very rich in industry. We need to turn now to Chamberlain's reaction to this challenge. The Germans were telling the British government that the situation in Sudeten Germany was becoming so unstable that Hitler was considering a military invasion, allegedly to protect the Sudeten Germans. What were Chamberlain's options in this situation? Well, of course, he could just do nothing. He could just let Hitler invade. Secondly, he could tell the Germans that he had a mutual defence pact with Czechoslovakia. He could literally fight Germany if Germany attacked Czechoslovakia. Of course, Britain didn't have a mutual defence pact with Czechoslovakia, although the French did. They signed one in 1924. There's no way the French, though, would have fought Hitler without Britain saying that they would support them. Or thirdly, he could try a midway. He could try to reach an agreement through making some kind of concession to Hitler. In September 1938, Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times to meet Hitler. This was despite the fact that he had a terrible fear of flying. It shows just how desperate he was. Now, when he shakes hands with Hitler here at Munich, the so-called Munich Peace Treaty, Chamberlain has said to Hitler he will accept the Sudetenland being annexed to Germany. He will accept Hitler's forces taking control of that territory. Well, was he right to do that? Let's start with arguments that appeasement was not justified first. Argument number 1, Czechoslovakia was partitioned against its will. The Czech president Beneš was not party to the negotiations. He was literally left outside the room. And he discovered later, when the meeting was over, what Chamberlain and Hitler had decided to do with his country. The second argument is to do with the fact that Czechoslovakia had lost its factories and its military fortifications. That's to say that if there was to be a war eventually between Germany and Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia had lost the very things it depended on to protect itself, its munitions and its positions of resistance against an invader. The third criticism of Chamberlain's policy is this: the non-aggression pledge that Hitler signed when he was at Munich. Now, this pledge said that Hitler promised that the two peoples, Britain and Germany, would never go to war again. When Chamberlain returned from Munich, he waved the piece of paper, proclaiming that he believed it was peace in our time, to cheering crowds, incidentally. Of course, we know what Hitler's intentions were, and so Chamberlain is perceived as being very naive. Firstly, to have got Hitler to sign what was, after all, just a piece of paper, and secondly, to apparently believe in Hitler's promise. Now, the arguments for appeasement being justified are rather more practical arguments. The first point would be this: Chamberlain was buying time, particularly to build up the air force of Great Britain. Could Chamberlain win a war in Czechoslovakia in 1938 against Nazi land forces? I don't think anybody believed that he really could. And this table indicates that in the time that he bought, Great Britain made enormous strides in terms of building up its air forces in particular, but also its land army. The second practical consideration was the allies of Great Britain. For example, would the Empire, Canada, Australia, India, would they join a war over the Sudeten crisis? The Canadians made it pretty clear that they wouldn't, for instance, and neither would America, of course. America was steadfastly neutral at this point. In fact, Congress had signed the so-called Neutrality Acts in the mid-1930s. So, given that Britain relied so heavily on its empire for its military power, Britain had to be sure that its colonies and the dominions would willingly enter into what they knew was going to be a very bitter war. And the fourth point is practical too. Chamberlain knew that British public opinion in September of 1938 was not fully in favour of starting a war against Nazi Germany. For instance, this famous peace ballot of 1935, which asks, do you consider that if a nation insists on attacking another, other nations should combine to compel it to stop by, if necessary, economic and non-military measures or by military measures? You'll see that there was a large majority in favour of non-military measures. Well, perhaps public opinion had shifted since 1935, but it wasn't absolutely clear whether it had. So here's the famous photograph with Chamberlain back home holding the non-aggression agreement up for the cameras. Had Hitler tricked him? It's possible it was the other way round. Maybe Chamberlain was leading Hitler into thinking that the Allies were weak, but in fact he was buying time for the Allies to prepare themselves and galvanise themselves. Certainly, years later, Hitler expressed regret that he didn't have war in 1938 when he was ready and his population were mobilised, because when it came to war in 1939, the British population, the French population, they were far readier for the confrontation. So here we have March 1939, Hitler ordered an invasion. The Munich peace treaty was in tatters. This is probably why Chamberlain has a bad reputation, because on the face of it, his policy of appeasement only lasted 6 months, and then Hitler went against the whole deal. He invades Czechoslovakia in the west and absorbs that territory into the German Reich, and you can see in yellow a new country, an independent Slovak Republic, which was of course really just a fascist puppet state of Germany. Focus question 4 asks us, how important was the Nazi-Soviet Pact? Well, now our attention needs to turn to Poland. Why? With Czechoslovakia now gone and dissolved, in that same month, Chamberlain ordered a treaty to be signed with Poland, the Anglo-Polish Alliance Treaty. Now, France already had a defence treaty with Poland. They signed that in 1921. And this treaty with Great Britain meant that Poland had both France and Britain now as defenders in the event of an attack. So now Britain and Poland had a mutual defence pact, and Stalin wanted the same. His foreign minister Litvinov was given the job of trying to secure an Anglo-Soviet agreement. Well, Chamberlain was reluctant. Why? Chamberlain was very reluctant. Firstly, he was deeply suspicious of Soviet communism. Secondly, the Poles would have to agree that Stalin could move forces into their country to defend them against Nazi Germany. Would the Polish government agree to that? They told Chamberlain there was no way they were going to agree to that. So Chamberlain didn't reach any kind of agreement with Stalin in May or June of 1939. So Stalin sacks Litvinov in the summer of 1939 and replaces him with Molotov. Stalin was hearing that the Nazis were coming up with an offer. Ribbentrop was Hitler's foreign minister. It was Ribbentrop who was beginning to dangle the idea of a Nazi-Soviet pact. One reason why Stalin probably sacked Litvinov is that he was a Soviet Jew. By replacing him with Molotov, and Molotov was perceived as being more pro-German, he was signalling to the Nazis that he was prepared to listen. What would they have in mind? And this is what they had in mind. Hitler was essentially offering the Soviet Union the eastern part of Poland and the Baltic states if he turned a blind eye to a Nazi invasion of the western part of Poland. Stalin told Molotov to accept this deal. And so here we have them signing it. Molotov here with his pen in hand, Stalin overlooking him, signing a deal with the mortal enemy of the Soviet Union, fascist Germany. This cartoon indicates just how cynical this so-called marriage is. They're both armed, aren't they? And here's the famous one of David Lowe, where Poland is lying prostrate as Hitler and Stalin kind of insult one another. So what were Hitler and Stalin's motives in signing this deal? Because after all, weren't they supposed to be mortal enemies? Hitler first. He could invade Poland without fear of a Soviet response. You may remember, in fact, Poland and the USSR actually had a defence alliance. Well, that was worthless now because Stalin had agreed not to fight Hitler. Second, it prevented the Anglo-Soviet alliance, which had been proposed a few months before by Litvinov. Well, no danger of that now. So Hitler had successfully avoided the threat of a war in the east and the west at the same time. And so what of Stalin? Well, he'd secured eastern Poland. That had always been an ambition. But also the Baltic states and even Finland. Hitler was prepared for him to even intervene in Finland. All of this amounted to a major buffer zone for the Soviets. Well, a buffer zone for what? Perhaps an all-out war with Germany. So Stalin was actually buying time, rather like Chamberlain had been. He was buying time before the expected all-out war with Nazi Germany, whenever that was to come. So the Nazi-Soviet Pact could be said to be the proximate cause of World War II. It gives Hitler the green light to invade the Polish corridor. Remember the hated Polish corridor, the bit of the Versailles Treaty that was most loathed by the Nazis. On the right-hand side, we have Nazi forces invading Danzig on the 1st of September 1939. Well, what's Chamberlain got to do? This newspaper signals his declaration of war. He's obliged to, isn't he, because of his March treaty with the Poles. So focus question 5 asks us, why did Britain and France declare war on Germany in September 1939? And it should be very, very clear by now. The treaties were already broken down. Hitler had come to power with the express objective of ripping them up. Appeasement had failed to satisfy Hitler's demands. There was no way that Hitler was now going to agree to resolve his differences diplomatically. He actually wanted war. Thirdly, declared war on Germany because Polish sovereignty was important to the whole security of Europe. That's to say, France and Britain wanted Poland not only to be independent, but for it to be strong as a counterweight to Germany and the Soviet Union. Fourthly, Britain and France were not fully ready, I suppose, but readier than they were a year before. So war readiness was another reason. And fifthly, the League of Nations had collapsed. There's no record of any debate or any discussion about the Nazi invasion of Poland. when Chamberlain declared war on Nazi Germany on 3rd September 1939, he brought the rest of the empire with him. And so that meant that a European conflict had become a world war.